The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, a look at whether Canada's food system is dominated by monopoly. Then we speak with the director and producer of the TVO original, Beethoven's 9. That's next on The Agenda. A new report from the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project argues Canada's food system is being undermined by monopoly. And while grocery stores have become an easy target for consumer anger over the cost of food, this report says consolidation has occurred at all levels of the supply chain. Here to discuss the report and whether more competition is required to address these issues, we welcome, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. In the nation's capital, Keldon Bester, Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project and a former Special Advisor at Canada's Competition Bureau. In Waterloo, Ontario, Jennifer Clapp, Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. And in Scarborough, Ontario, Gary Sands, Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Canadian Federation of Independent Grocers. And it's great to have you four on TVO tonight. Keldon, let's just get you started right away, please. Why do you think the Anti-Monopoly Project on this issue is such a big deal?
Well, I think a big part of why we wrote the report and why the organization exists is the fact that while some of these issues can be very front of mind, at the grocery aisle, they actually run much deeper in our economy. So what we wanted to do with this report is to recognize that, yes, there are competition issues at the grocery store, but those are also the byproduct of consolidation that runs much further up the chain that we need to take seriously.
Sylvain, can you give us a sense of how much consolidation there actually is in the food system in our country today?
Well, there's been lots across the food chain from farm gate to plate. And in fact, all nodes of the supply chain have actually consolidated more because the other nodes have consolidated. But when you look at the grocery business in Canada over the last 30, 40 years, it's interesting that now we're asking for more competition when in actuality it was really an American invasion back in the 90s or 80s, 90s that actually led to the infrastructure we have today. So Walmart and Costco obviously have actually entered the Canadian market quite successfully, and that really pushed other players to consolidate, which is why we have just a few Canadian players now, Loblaw, Sobeys, and Metro, because all three players have actually adjusted to a much more competitive landscape as a result.
Jennifer, I don't have to tell you, and I think anybody who's been following this story will know that, grocery store CEOs have been called to Parliament Hill to testify over high food prices. Some people have advocated boycotting various stores because of the consolidation. Where in the chain, as you look at it, does consolidation really begin?
Well, consolidation, as was already mentioned, is all through the agri-food supply chains, and it really begins in agricultural inputs, which are the seeds, the chemicals, the farm machinery, the fertilizers that farmers use in their fields and their agricultural operations, and that consolidation tracks through from that production level all the way through to the grain and commodity handling level, all the way through to food processing and finally at retail. So it's really everywhere in the food chain, and we sometimes forget that the parts that are furthest from the grocery store, such as fertilizer prices and seed prices, et cetera, those are really coming from very concentrated industries as well. So in Canada, just a few firms are dominating each of those nodes in the supply chain.
Gary, before I get you to weigh in, let me just add some numbers to what you've heard so far, and then you can comment on all of it if you like. This is some polling information that we want to share, and it says last year 90% of Canadian farmers reported they were concerned about consolidation in their industry, with the highest perceptions of negative impact coming from the input provider stage of the supply chain, equipment dealers at 66%, fertilizer manufacturers at 62%, seed and chemical companies 60%, grain companies 56%. There's a healthy majority there that is concerned about all of this. Okay, you weigh in. How do you view what's going on out there?
Well, we've been concerned for many, many years about the consolidation throughout the supply chain in Canada. And it's, I think, unfortunate that many respects the focus has been on the retail sector. But I think your program tonight is very helpful to consumers to understand it runs right through the supply chain. And it definitely has had an impact on competition. The only caveat I would make would be sometimes that consolidation does not always impact prices. What I'm trying to say there is you can't always link the rising food prices that we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years completely on the issue of consolidation. There's a number of other factors that have been impacting those rising costs.
Do you want to weigh in on that as well? For example, what?
Well, the factors that have been driving up costs, the war in Ukraine is still having an impact. Rail and port disruptions. We've had climate catastrophes, flooding, wildfires, etc. It's like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have taken up careers in the food industry. There's just been so many things that we've seen. And listen, I'm not an apologist for the chains, and perhaps some of my fellow panelists here are going to disagree with me, but we are seeing a lot of increases from our suppliers. Now the rate has slowed of those increases, and the degree of the increases has not been as significant, but we're still seeing a lot of increases from our suppliers. And if you're in retail grocery, I'll just speak for the independents, you have a margin of 2%. You're passing that on. You don't have a choice.
Keldon, do you agree that, to use Gary's words, there are other apocalyptic things happening here to contribute to the circumstances in which we find ourselves?
Absolutely. There's always multiple factors going on here, but with the question of competition, especially in the past couple of years, you think about monopoly as the ability to pass on and not have to share the burden of those costs. So over the past years, we've seen different segments of the chain, both the beef processors, the manufacturers of consumer packaged goods, and grocers in Canada who have been able to either maintain or slightly expand margins in comparison to their equivalents in the United Kingdom. The question is, when those factors occur, who shares the burden and who can pass that on further down the chain?
Should we just, Jennifer, look at one part of that chain in particular? Farmers are very concerned about the costs of machinery and what they feel are unfair prices, I gather. Give us a sense about what's happening in that part of the food chain, if I can put it that way.
Right. Well, certainly the disruptions from COVID and the war in Ukraine have raised prices of many, many goods across supply chains, and especially with energy and material costs going up. And this means machinery prices are higher, and so are fertilizer prices. And the prices of these inputs have gone up quite sharply in recent years. And this has been a big concern because and we're concerned about concentration in particular, I should say, because when these disruptions happen, when you do have consolidation, it does give those firms a bit of cover to raise prices beyond their increased costs. And that's one of the big concerns that farmer groups have had, is that these companies have even said so in their earnings reports, that the increased prices that they've been able to charge have outweighed their increased costs. So as Keldon said, he's absolutely right. The question is, who is bearing the burden of the higher prices? And when you do have consolidation, those firms have more market power, and it enables them to pass on those costs to consumers.
Is it inevitable, Sylvain, that consumers are going to have to pay for the additional costs every step along the chain?
Likely, but not always. I do want to push the panel a little bit to think further about monopolies. I, for one, believe that there are no monopolies in the food industry. They don't necessarily exist. Of course, companies will go after control and power. That's business. But there is a difference between business and abuse. And there is abuse within the system, and Gary would know that very well. And that's why there's been a lot of discussion around a code of conduct. Companies like Loblaws and Walmart, they do abuse their power up the food chain, and that forces processors and beyond farmers to consolidate and seek more power and control. That's really what leads to what we're seeing today. So consumers have every right to be concerned about control and power, or over powering positions within the food system.
Just before I get Keldon to comment on that, Sylvain, maybe you could help us understand what, in your view, is the difference between control and power and abuse. Where's that line?
I'll give you two examples, Steve. One, property controls. Right now, and Loblaw was the first one to acknowledge that they are implementing property controls. They will have a store, and right next door, they could actually ask another tenant or another food store not to carry certain products, so they can actually monopolize that geographical space. Those are called property controls. That's abuse, in my view. They shouldn't be allowed in Canada. Also, companies, grocers, will charge fees. A lot of people don't know this, but to do business with grocers in Canada, you have to pay them. And often these fees change from one month to another. There are stiff penalties as well if you're late with your delivery, and that suffocates processing and farmers as well. And they companies like Loblaws and Walmart, yet again, those are companies that will implement extra fees out of the blue, and that really hurts the rest of the industry typically.
What are the fees for?
Listing fees, marketing fees, shelf space. As a consumer, you don't necessarily see those fees, but it does impact behavior, your choices, and access to certain products. And sometimes there are innovators out there that just can't have access to consumers because the gatekeepers are really the massive grocers that we have in our country.
Okay, Keldon, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think there's a good point here about the path to consolidation making that abuse more likely. As we've seen with the bread price fixing case, which is still ongoing in Canada, as you get fewer and fewer players in the market, the relationships between them get cozier, and I think the chances for that sort of abusive conduct to happen and for it to have a broader scope becomes greater. If a very small grocer is implementing property controls, that's much different than a handful of companies that might control some of the most premium real estate across the country. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in today.
Gary, for you and the people you represent, where do you draw the line between just trying to grab bigger market share and do better business versus abusing your position in the marketplace?
Well, I agree with Sylvain. Property controls is definitely one of the issues that we have raised over the last few years with the Competition Bureau. I would tell you another example of abuse that we have seen in the industry, and that's around the issue of fair supply. So we have about 6,900 independent grocers in Canada. A myriad of them are in rural, remote, Indigenous communities, and often notwithstanding that they might have an agreement, large chains have in the past made demands of suppliers to supply them with extra if something is in high demand or low supply, and that diverts supply of goods away from the independents, particularly those ones in those rural and remote and Indigenous communities, and that has been a real problem for us, an abuse in our view that needed to be addressed. We've tried to address that in our grocery code of conduct, and I'm hopeful that when the code goes into effect, that there'll be some movement to correct that abuse.
Well, for what it's worth, the producer of this segment reached out to the Retail Council of Canada, has spent a good chunk of the last 3 days, including through the weekend, trying to get a statement in time for our broadcast here. Alas, a statement was not provided in time, but there is this on their website. So let me read this, and then we can have a chat about what the Retail Council of Canada says there. They say they're pleased to see that the Competition Bureau Retail Grocery Market Study report did not make any finding that grocery profits have been excessive or that grocers have padded margins during this inflationary period. Indeed, the Bureau found grocer profit levels to be, quote, modest. The greedflation smear is officially dead, so says the Council. The fact remains that grocery prices have gone up because of a confluence of global factors affecting grocery inputs, War, extreme weather, and soaring fuel prices all piling on top of supply chain disruptions and labor shortages. Okay, that's their statement from the Retail Council of Canada. Let's tackle that. Jennifer, what do you want to say about that statement?
Well, it's first to say profits have risen in the retail sector. The question is about the marginal profit ratios, and I think they have been modest, and they typically are modest in the grocery retail sector. But consumers are seeing the food price rises at the grocery store, and so that's where their concern is. But it's true that when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw huge spikes in grain prices, and part of that had to do with financial speculators on agricultural commodity markets, and that kind of filtered through the food system and raised costs for processors, and then that also raised costs for at the retail end. But also we saw those inputs rising as well. So farmers' costs were going up because of higher energy prices, higher fertilizer prices, and so all of those price waves worked their way through the system. But I think we still can look at the grocery retail sector and see that they did see their profits rise in 2021, 2022, and 2023, as shown in that report from the Competition Bureau.
Keldon, they're quite categorical in this statement. They say the greedflation smear is officially dead. Is it in your mind?
Well, we're dealing in this binary that either they're the cause of all our problems or they're off the hook. And again, going back to why we wrote this report is to say it is more complicated than that, but the retail space owns part of this. And, when costs increase, but your margin remains flat on an absolute basis, you are making more profits. So while grocers are only one piece of this, and we're very clear about that, they are a piece of that. And as we've been discussing here, there are some real competition issues that I think we could address and have a much fairer market.
Okay, Sylvain, I have to say every time I see you interviewed on television, which is quite a bit lately because this is such a hot topic, you take pains to say and to point out that there is, there's no abuse out there, or let me rephrase that. There is very little abuse out there in the retail sector. There are not excessive profits being taken, that there's actually responsible behavior being exercised by the retailers in this space. And yet, if I look in the business sections of the newspapers on the same day, you will see just enormous profits being made in this sector. So can you square what seem to be two conflicting facts there?
Yes, I have 2 points, Steve. One, I think the one metric that we should look at when it comes to greed, if you will, is to look at gross margins. And if you look at gross margins of the big three, so Metro, Loblaws, and Empire Sobeys, three of them are publicly traded companies in Canada. Gross margins have actually remained relatively the same over the last 5-6 years. And the gross margins are very important because it will look at revenues minus the cost of goods. If that increases, it means that they are likely increasing more prices versus the cost of goods. That's one thing. The other thing that people need to keep in mind when they look at profits is that all of these companies are highly diversified. They actually make more money selling other things than food. If you look at Loblaw's quarterly results last week, half of the profits of Loblaw come from shoppers selling medication, clothing, cosmetics, and things like that. So if you want to accuse a company like Loblaws of greed because they're selling, say, lipstick, well, you may have a case. But when it comes to food, same-store sales have remained under 2%, which is under food inflation right now.
Keldon, does that ring true with you?
Well, going to the retail split out, one point in particular, Loblaw had the opportunity with the Competition Bureau's grocery market study to provide, the broken out financial data that would have really put to bed those claims over where's the source of the margin increases they were seeing. So the Competition Bureau now has the power to actually compel information from companies to answer those questions once and for all. But I think Loblaw missed an opportunity to say, if that hypothesis is true, then show us the data for it.
Jennifer, should they be forced to put forward that data as asked, if asked by the Competition Bureau?
Yes, well, We really have a problem in general of a lack of transparency with respect to data for those of us who are studying in this space. So I'm sure my co-panelists here share the frustration with the lack of data and information that we have at our fingertips to do these kind of analyses. But having said that, making more of that data available publicly while it's useful for us to do studies, it could actually facilitate cooperation and collusion among the firms as well. So we have to be careful about how we go about improving transparency. But I would agree that definitely we do need more of that transparency. And what is going on as well is that when the Competition Bureau is looking for evidence of collusion among firms, in the past they would look for an agreement that would show, something written down that would show that firms had agreed to collude on either raising prices to consumers or lowering prices that they would pay to their suppliers. But in today's digital world, it's really difficult to basically find that kind of information. It could be behind encrypted messaging, or it could simply be tacit collusion because there are so few players in the marketplace. So it's a complicated landscape, and the digitalization and data is making it difficult. So there are some cases right now in the U.S. where they're actually investigating meat packers, for example, for colluding via data services. So it's a tricky situation.
Gary, I should get you to weigh in on whether or not your business has a transparency problem.
I agree. I think that more transparency would only be helpful. But, if there's one message I just want to, Steve, if I can loop back to what I was saying at the beginning, is there is no doubt that the consolidation in this industry has undermined or impacted the ability of other competitors to be able to fairly compete. It's impacted the ability to get fair supply in a myriad of communities, as I said. But I do want to stress, notwithstanding our concerns about that, the abuse of dominance that we've seen over the last several years, and the behaviors that needed to be addressed. I think it's important that your viewers understand we do need to separate the issue of prices, because that is by far got to be the most important issue that is confronting Canadians today, is the prices they're paying for things. And again, I see, because through my members, I see the price increases that we're getting from suppliers. And if Loblaws and Metro and Sobeys are getting the same increases that we're seeing, they do have to be passed on. I just, again, in closing, just want to say we have seen no evidence of greedflation. We just haven't. And we would be the first to point our fingers at the chains if we thought they were doing something to undermine the system. And we do when they engage in certain behaviors. And that's, by the way, although they did it with different degrees of enthusiasm, they did sign on to the Grocery Code of Conduct. And the Grocery Code of Conduct, by them signing on, the distorted market practices that we've tried to address in the code is an admission by the industry that we have too much consolidation, and it's created some problems that have undermined the system, and they need to be addressed.
All right, in which case, let me circle back to Sylvain and get him to address the point that Keldon put on the record a few moments ago, which is Loblaw could have availed themselves of the opportunity to be more transparent when they were asked for certain information. Should they still do that?
I would say so, absolutely. You see, Steve, even though I do question the greedflation accusations out there that have been rampant for many, many months now, we need to recognize that things have been quite cozy for grocers in Canada. If you look at Kroger, Albertsons in the U.S., and you look at their margins, they've been stable, but they're half of what they are in Canada. And so even though margins have been stable in Canada, they are substantially higher on average than in the U.S. And I do question whether or not we take competition very seriously in Canada. In the U.S. right now, the FTC, which is equivalent to the Competition Bureau in Canada, is suing Kroger and Albertsons because they're trying to merge. It's been going on since October 2022. While in Canada, we've seen major transactions like Loblaws acquiring Shoppers in 2013. No one said anything. Metro acquired A&P No one reacted. And also Sobeys acquired Safeway again back in 2013, and no one said anything at all. And so I do question whether or not we take competition very seriously in Canada.
Keldon, that takes me to you. In our remaining time here, I think we should all have a chance to put some feelings on the record as to if we have a transparency problem, if we have an anti-monopoly problem, we need some recommendations for the Competition Bureau. Okay, Keldon, you're on.
Well, the first point is to really reverse what Sylvain was talking about. We need to take consolidation seriously, and we need to be challenging these mergers. Any further consolidation should be under a very strict microscope. And, the reality is it's difficult to go backwards, but the first step is to play a strong defense. The next thing to do is to think about, those practices that might be harming fair competition, whether they're property controls or collusion. We really need a focus on that, not just at the grocery level, but all the way up the chain. And we encourage the Bureau to use its new powers, particularly these market studies and expanded abuse of dominance, to go further up the chain and understand that what's going on in these extremely consolidated markets. Third, things like the Grocery Code of Conduct. Our experience, looking at the experience of the UK, suggests that eventually something in statute may be required to go after specific harmful practices. But again, I think these are good first steps and a part of taking competition seriously, finally.
Jennifer, what would you add to that?
Yes, well, I would agree that we definitely need stronger competition policies in Canada. And worldwide, competition policies have been weakened since the 1980s. And it's interesting that the U.S. has taken a bit of a stronger stand in recent years because the Biden administration really took charge and decided to strengthen competition policies in the U.S. And I do think that Canada needs to follow suit because for too long, the Competition Authority has just turned a blind eye to these major mergers that have led to considerable consolidation that raises these concerns about market power in the economy. And in the food system, it really matters. Food is a basic need. It's a human right. It's provides livelihoods for over a third of humanity. It's important for culture. It's tied to ecosystems. Food is really important. And so we have to consider the consequences of concentration in the sector.
Gary, okay, I certainly stand to be corrected on this, but if you look back over the last 25 years, there's only one really significant example I can think of when somebody stepped in and really struck a blow against monopolistic practices and against breaking up the monopolies. And that's when Paul Martin, when he was finance minister, told a couple of the big banks, no, I'm sorry, you cannot merge. But for the most part, we don't seem to be all that interested in striking a blow for more competition and fewer monopolistic practices. Why is that, do you think?
I don't know. It's been a source of frustration and actually anger from our standpoint, from the independent grocers. The mergers and acquisitions that have been allowed to take place, and Steve, it's not just at the retail sector. So I'll give you an example of the kinds of things that have been approved by the Bureau, because sometimes you'll have a big acquisition and they'll force the company to divest a few retail stores. But let's take Ontario. We're TV Ontario here in Ontario. 59% of the retail grocery stores in Ontario are independents. But the two biggest wholesalers are Loblaws and Sobeys. So if you're an independent, in a lot of cases, you're buying from your retail competitor. That's a situation that should never, ever have been allowed to occur. Unfortunately, in my view, I don't know how we put the toothpaste back in the tube. I really think we need to have a conversation as an industry and with governments about what can we do to support independent grocers and help that sector grow and stay on the playing field. It's never going to be a level playing field, but what can we do to help them stay on the field?
Well, coincidentally, Sylvain, as I gave you the last word on this discussion, we just this second heard back from the Competition Bureau. And here's the statement they gave us. I'm going to read you the statement. It's not that long, and then I'll have you comment on wrap this discussion up. The Bureau says, as noted in our annual plan, we continue to prioritize investigations of anti-competitive conduct and mergers that make everyday life less affordable for Canadians, such as in the retail, grocery, and food supply sector. And we are committed to implementing the recent major legislative changes to the Competition Act and applying new tools to prevent, detect, and address anti-competitive activity in these sectors. That's what the Competition Bureau says. Sylvain, react to that if you would.
Well, the Bureau does have new tools, and I'm just hoping, and I suspect that my fellow panelists hope that they will also use these new more data and information. My guess is that with the Trump administration down south, things are only going to get worse. This is likely going to be an M&A friendly administration. Kroger will merge with Albertsons, and that could actually have major implications in the U.S. and in Canada as well. And I'm also thinking about other potential mergers that could happen as well. So we need to be ready and clear about what our intent is to protect the integrity of the food system and protect consumers as well.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, everybody, for that discussion. Jennifer Clapp at the University of Waterloo, Gary Sands from the Independent Grocers, Keldon Bester from CAMP, the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, Sylvain Charlebois, Dalhousie University. It was great of all of you to come on to TVO tonight and help us out with this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What is the greatest piece of music ever written? Well, if you said Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, you'll get no argument here. But how to describe a documentary about the Ninth, which includes Russia's immoral war against Ukraine, Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel a year ago, and the cartoonist who created Charlie Brown? Complicated? You bet. So here are the director, writer, and narrator, Larry Weinstein, and one of the producers, Liam Romalis, to talk about Beethoven's Nine, Ode to Humanity, which I have to say is a sensational documentary. I've seen it twice already, and I'm going to see it again. So first of all, welcome you two.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
And let's play a little clip from the documentary so we can tell everybody what this thing's about. Sheldon, if you would, roll it.
This is a film in which we set out to feature 9 subjects who somehow embody Beethoven, his Ninth Symphony, and the ideals that inspired him. What resulted is not the film that I had expected to make.
Tell us more. What kind of movie did you set out to make?
We had been commissioned by, primarily by Arte, the cultural station in Germany, to make a film to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And so we were thinking about different aspects of that. In truth, I wasn't sure I even wanted to do it because I had already made a film about Beethoven. But then we were thinking, what if we talk about the ideals of the Enlightenment that inspired Beethoven? Why don't we come up with some ideas of people who kind of overlap with those ideals? And what if we approached the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra, made up of refugees from Ukraine that formed just after that war broke out, that terrible war, and founded by and conducted by Carrie Lynn Wilson, who is from Winnipeg, but who has a Ukrainian family. What if we, and it was built on the ideals of humanism and of freedom and peace, and which is what inspired Beethoven. So what if we try to combine all these ingredients as well as find other people and
essentially 9 people and how the ninth affected them.
Yes, it's sort of like Ocean's 11. The idea, it's not called Beethoven's Ninth, it's called Beethoven's Nine.
Exactly. That's not quite what happened.
Well,
that
isn't quite what happened, but I do want to say that when Larry approached me and my partner Jason about this film, it was, he said, I'm really not sure I want to make this film, and we have basically less than a year. So we had, for a feature-length documentary, that's an incredibly short amount of time. So the challenge, of course, is you have to move very quickly. All of the pieces have to fall into place. You have to start reaching out to people. And it was very clear that we didn't want to do a traditional music doc because there's no sense in that. There have been countless docs made about Beethoven's Ninth, analyzing each movement. We wanted to do something that was about the here and now, something that, although this is a piece that's 200 years old, it's unbelievable that we're still listening to it and it's still as ubiquitous as ever. We really wanted to comment about the world we live in today.
And it was the first major symphony in which people sang. And there are so many extraordinary moments in your film, Larry, but none more so than when Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy, is sung in Ukrainian.
Yes.
Not in the original German, but in Ukrainian, and they changed some of the words. Tell me about that.
Yeah, Carrie Lynn thought she was inspired by the fact that when Schiller first wrote the poem, which inspired Beethoven when he was 15 years old, and Beethoven always knew that he wanted to set it to music, but didn't until the end of his life. But it was Ode to Joy that he had written. And then Leonard Bernstein performed it in 1989 with the Berlin Wall coming down, and he changed it to Ode to Freedom, which is apparently what Schiller first wanted to call it. And that inspired Carrie Lynn to go Ode to Glory?
Ode to Glory.
Glory, because Slava is sort of the thing that they talk about all the time.
Slava Ukraine.
Yes.
Yeah.
So she wanted, and then it occurred to her, okay, because she got all these forces together. I had approached her to do this piece of music, and I was sure they would say no, because you don't just get a full orchestra, a full choir and soloist together in this little amount of time we had. But she decided to do this in Poland and was given a Polish choir. And so 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the performance, she thought, let's do it in Ukrainian. It will have so much more meaning. But the poor Polish choir had to learn Ukrainian.
Which they did brilliantly. And here, we got a statement here from Carrie Lynn Wilson. Sheldon, let's bring this up. She writes, as Ukraine continues its fight on behalf of the free world, it needs our support more than ever, and we will proudly take our message across Europe and the United States in an expression of love for Ukraine and our steadfastness in our resistance to tyranny. They are... This is like an all-star band, right, Liam? They've just sort of brought the band together, and they are out there making their music and making their message, aren't they?
They are what really made this film, I think, possible. When you reached out to Carrie Lynn Wilson, and she said, and you fully expected her to say, forget it. Yeah. No, there's no way we're going to perform the Ninth. We can't pull it off. When she said, no, we'd love to do the Ninth, and we'd love to do it in Warsaw with the Polish National Opera. It really, it felt like the film had the momentum out of the blocks that it needed.
One of the other 9 you feature is a guy named Steven Pinker, whom Canadians will know because he's one of us, and now, of course, a Harvard professor, author of Enlightenment Now. And as you were including him in the documentary, I wonder if you had a moment where you thought his book is about enlightenment now, and he's suggesting that now is the best time in human history to be born in.
Yes.
But we feel like a million miles away from enlightenment right now, don't we?
Yeah, it's really hard to reconcile this, that we live in the best of all possible worlds, the best of all possible times, and which is kind of the thesis of his book. And he has very convincing evidence that it is, and that these other things that are terrible are kind of blips. And that in the trends of the world, that we have more education, we have more wealth, we have actually more compassion. In many ways, the environment crisis is something that we actually deal with, unlike the past. In many ways, and the birth rates and all these things are much, much better than they have ever been. And yet, yes, it feels like things are very bleak.
I got to confess, I've never heard of Monika Brodka. Then again, I'm not quite her target demographic. She's the Beethoven of Polish rock, you tell us, 36 years old, and a real, that's not even alternative rock. What would you call what she does?
Well, she is a bona fide Polish pop star. Right. She's a rock star, pop star.
Punk star.
Punk star. She commands audiences of thousands and thousands of people.
Had she heard of Beethoven's Ninth before this?
She has. However, I think that the role of Monika Brodka, or Brodka as she likes to be known, was to sort of experience the Ninth through her eyes. She was the person perhaps least familiar with the Ninth, and that's why when there's a wonderful scene when she comes to the concert hall where the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra and Carrie Lynn Wilson are rehearsing, we were really getting a sense of her, of this monumental symphony washing over her. In some ways for the first time. Of course, she talks about the Ode to Joy. She says, you know, if you stop 10 people on the street, 9 of them will certainly know the Ode to Joy.
Yeah.
But there's another reason why I think we were attracted to her. We found out in the process of, like, I have to admit, I don't love the melody of the Ode to Joy. It seems really banal.
What?
No,
That's heretical to say.
On TV, you have to...
This moment of heresy brought to you by Larry Weinstein. Okay.
Well, I think first year piano students when they're little kids all play Ode to Joy. I remember playing on the piano Ode to Joy and then quitting piano. And a lot, and you know, it's just a really common thing. But I was talking to a musicologist, a Beethoven musicologist, and they said, don't you realize what he was doing? He was trying to create a folk song, something that sounded like it was hundreds of years old, primal, that anyone can sing. Accessible. And then when we found out that Monika Brodka, had grown up in the Polish mountains as a folk musician, and her father intended her to be part of that tradition, she can't shake that folk thing. It's like when she heard the Ode to Joy, she got it. She got it. And not to mention that she's in Poland, which is right next to Ukraine. And,
Indeed.
I mean, next to Russia. To Russia, yeah.
I want to circle back to something you said earlier in our conversation as it relates to Leonard Bernstein and his conducting of Beethoven's Ninth as the Berlin Wall was coming down, Christmas 1989. That's right. We have younger people watching us right now who will have no firsthand memory of this. So put them in that time. What was the significance of that concert at that moment?
Well, you know, this was at the end of the horrible Cold War. It was a leftover from World War II when communists and the capitalists and the different countries were fighting, and Germany had been divided to East and West Germany. Berlin was East and West Berlin, and there was this wall that was erected in 1961. It was a traumatic thing. It divided families. It divided friends, and it was just a very awful political act. And then in '89, that wall came down and it represented the unifying and a better world. Maybe we're now looking forward. And Bernstein was so moved by that he said, I want to conduct Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in Berlin. I'm going to do it in the East Berlin and West Berlin. And it was a very meaningful thing. And he knew he only had a few months to live, but he was determined to use every ounce of strength that he could.
Here's how you captured it in Beethoven's Nine. Sheldon, if you would.
My parents asked me whether we want to go to the wall and to chop some pieces out. So I took my ski goggles, which I bought a couple of years ago in Czechoslovakia, and we went to the wall and started chopping pieces out of the wall, as we did a couple of days before. And suddenly there was a lady staying next to us and saying, look, there's a guy coming that looks like Leonard Bernstein. And Bernstein was coming and said, I am Leonard Bernstein.
And there's Franz as a little guy. How did you find him? How did you find the guy in that picture?
Well, it's a great story. And I said, I don't want to have this in the film unless we find Franz. But because it is the 200th anniversary of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Beethoven Museum in Bonn, Germany, the birthplace of Beethoven, they had kind of been in contact with him. And they were going to display the hammer and chisel that Bernstein used in a big glass case. So through them, we found him. But I was warned, he's never been interviewed. He's going to be very shy. He doesn't want to talk. And he was effusive.
He was.
Yeah, it was really, he was a delightful surprise. And in a full circle moment, Beethoven's Nine premiered at Beethoven House in Bonn alongside the Hammer and Chisel this past May. So it really felt like, very organic.
And Franz was there with his father who brought him to the wall. And I was just staring. It's like, I'll not look at the film. I want to watch them. And they were glowing. And the other person who was there was the daughter of Leonard Bernstein, Jamie Bernstein, who was just so moved and so, yeah. It was nice.
Larry, I have to make a very hard turn here.
Yeah.
Because we're going to talk about something that was very unanticipated when you started to make your movie.
Yeah.
And that came right home to you.
Mm-hmm.
Your sister, your brother-in-law were in Israel on October 7th of last year. And they lived in a kibbutz near Gaza. And they were directly involved, let's put it that way,
Yeah.
in all of the events of that day. How and why did you decide to put all that in your movie?
I didn't decide to do that. I have made a lot of films in my life. I had never been in one of my films. I never narrated a film, except for one other film. That's a TV Ontario film on propaganda. But I just, at one point, because I'd been filming the Ukrainian orchestra members, talking to them about war and trauma, the cameraman that I've worked with for many years, John Min Tran, was walking with me and he said, Larry, I have this idea and you're going to hate it. I need to turn the camera on you. And I'm getting emotional. And I'm going to call Liam and Jason at Riddle Films and your German producers at 3B and find out, get them to submit questions to you. And tomorrow morning, we're going to do an interview. And you're going to be on the film and you're going to talk about it. And I thought, oh, I don't want to do this. I was in such denial. Let's just keep making the film that we were going to make. That's what I was referring to at the beginning. And so finally I said, yeah, I have to. I have to.
You did. You made the right decision.
Yes, yes. So he ended up following me, and then he said, right after we finished the interview, it was such a sigh of relief, and he said, what are you doing now? And I said, oh, I'm going to go and visit my mother. I need to be with her. And he said, I'm going to follow you. So he just kept following me, and then my daughter. And
yes, she was in it too.
Yeah.
Now, there's a moment in the movie, you're obviously after the 7th of October, your sister and her husband go missing, and you don't know where they are.
Yeah.
And you end up getting Melanie Joly, the Minister of Foreign Affairs,
Yes.
on the phone.
Yes.
And she's assuring you that what she's about to tell you ought to be off the record and not for publication.
Oh, right. She did say that.
She did, and you guys are rolling on it, and it's in the movie.
Yeah.
Did you get any satisfaction out of that phone call with her?
It wasn't just the phone. Well, she told us some information we didn't know.
Right.
We didn't know that that it wasn't all the hostages weren't in one place. They were in different
And
places.
we're not all taken by the same group.
Yeah. I subsequently, my daughter Allie and I were in Ottawa and had meetings with her, and she was really very sympathetic, but also she assured us of what Canada was trying to do at the in Qatar, and anyway, we really felt better having spoken with her, but we knew it was hopeless. We knew information right away that looked bad, but I think we were kind of admonished. I had to deal with Israeli IDF and intelligence, and I felt almost admonished, as many of us in my family, for losing hope. And hope can be difficult if you think that it's hopeless.
Let me do one more follow-up on this. Your daughter wanted Minister Joly to denounce Israel. Your daughter wanted the minister to publicly, your Jewish daughter, I should add, wanted the minister to denounce Israel. Have you had any blowback from the Jewish community on that?
Surprisingly little. I had said something similar being interviewed by this station called CBC, sorry.
I've heard of it.
And I was accused of being a self-hating Jew. And it's like, no, I don't hate myself. I hate people like Netanyahu. So no, there was some blowback originally. And some of the people who were resistant have come to me and said, you know what? I believe what Ali was saying back then. I think that she was right. The thing is, that was only 3 weeks after October 7th that she said those things. And it was very strong of her. And Ali was very, very emotional. And in a weird way, afterwards, Leonard Bernstein kind of answers her well about having to be humane, having to be, anyway, yeah.
Gotcha.
It's very emotional, obviously, to talk about, and it involved a lot of people.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Liam, I wonder if after having made this picture, at some point I presume you asked yourself, how in heaven's name did Beethoven compose this potentially most beautiful piece of music ever composed in world history, and he was completely deaf at the time? How did he do it? Did you come to any conclusions on that?
You know, it's a great question. I have very few conclusions and just more admiration, I think, than anything else. The fact is that Beethoven, and we touch on this in the film, Beethoven was getting very near the end of his life. He was completely deaf. He was in pain. He was suffering. He had withdrawn from society. And the fact that he could find it in himself to create, to compose this work of art that is a plea for connectedness, for unity, for breaking down barriers between people. It's just an extraordinary feat, and it's one that I think that we really try and explore through all of the different characters and subjects in this film. I mean, this film, I believe, it truly is, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Did you ever come to a conclusion about that? How does a guy who can't hear a thing create something so gorgeous?
You know, I sometimes think about his deafness, and people talk about it's like the greatest tragedy of classical music and classical composers. And I think, well, you know, except the musicians were very limited back then. And in a way, did his deafness help him write music that was unfettered? Was it like the fact that he was completely deaf and that he could just write beautiful things, and he was insecure about it. He was insecure about the use of words, like I said, but at the end he accepted it. And I was just reading a quote of his today where he basically said, "I can now die. I've done this work. I'm ready to end." But I'm glad he didn't, because he wrote a lot of great string quartets afterwards.
In our last few minutes here, let's touch on this, the message of the ninth, the ultimate message. Alle Menschen werden Brüder. All men will be brothers someday. Having made the movie, Liam, start us off. How does that prognostication hit you now?
You know, it feels in the time we're living in that it's something that is pretty out of reach in many ways. However, I believe that this is something that we have to strive for continually. And all of us and all of the characters in our film, in their own way, are fighting against the pessimism, fighting against the darkness. Foremost among the stories is Larry, who, despite the awful, tragic circumstances that are documented in the film, you find a way to reach towards the light out of the darkness.
Did you, Larry?
I can't stand the dehumanization of people and the dehumanization of both sides. And for instance, in the Israel-Hamas thing, same in Ukraine and Russia. I believe in humanity. I feel like Beethoven's belief was inspirational to me. Beethoven wanted to set this beautiful poem. He waited to the end when he was deaf and he was in pain. And not just that, society had closed down. The aristocracy was increasingly rich, and there was more divide. The politicians were increasingly sociopathic and narcissistic in his own life, and also religion. There was the Restoration was becoming more closed and more. It was all anti-Enlightenment, and he wanted to write a love letter to humanity, and I think he wanted to write a love letter to us, to the future. Like, this is what we have to strive for in the face of darkness, and I think that we have to learn from that.
I want everybody to see this movie. And so I'm going to just spend a minute here telling people how they can do that, because it was on, I think we played it on TVO last night in prime time. It's on YouTube. So look for Beethoven's 9 on YouTube. You'll find it there. And then there is a special screening at the Royal Conservatory of Music's Kerner Hall, downtown Toronto, on the 19th of November. November 19. I think I'm emceeing that.
Oh.
Yeah. They're going to have a special screening. Gustavo Jimeno from the TSO is going to be there.
That's right.
And they're going to play some music afterwards.
That's right.
And it's going to be a night. It's going to be a night.
Yeah.
Is this your best movie? I think this is your best movie. I've seen almost all your movies. I think this is your best one.
You know what's funny? Towards the end of the film, Sarah Pauli saw it, and she said, "This is the film that you're going to be remembered for." And I went, "What about the other 40 films? Are they chopped liver?" but
They're not chopped liver, but this is the best. My opinion, for what it's worth.
Well, they say your last film is, whatever they say.
Only as good as your last film.
Well, if you're only as good as your last film, then you're pretty darn good, because this was great.
Thank you.
Liam Ramalis, founder, Riddle Films, producer of Beethoven's 9, Ode to Humanity. Larry Weinstein, Canadian, documentarian, director, writer, narrator. Beethoven's 9, Ode to Humanity. Don't walk to see it. Run to see it. Run to see it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Steve.
you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, November 18th, 2024. What does a Trump presidency mean for the war in Ukraine? We'll explore that tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.